Hey everybody, welcome back, and if this is your first time here, welcome. Today I want to speak directly to churches that are thinking about switching from acoustic drums to electronic drums. I see this topic nearly every day on some drummer forum, so I thought it would be a good idea for me to share my experience of many years not only playing acoustic drums, but I've been playing electronic drums for the last 30 years. I have been playing in church for the last 12 plus years. I've done well over 800 services, every size imaginable, on every type of kit configuration that you could possibly think of, both electronic and acoustic, all the way from a small meeting room, with 25 to 50 people, up to, mid-sized meeting room that holds 100 or 250 people, an old community-style church, and a very large campus seats nearly 1,200 people. And I've been out in the open, I've been behind a half glass shield, I've been behind, full glass shield, I've been in a full drum enclosure, full cage, everything. So basically, you name it, I've done it, and I thought it would be pretty helpful, again, for me to share my experience with this. So here in my home studio, I'm sitting behind a high-end Roland kit, and I'm not going to just jump in and say, you should get this, because this is very expensive. I really want to be sensitive to your budget, your needs, and I really want to bring up kind of some questions and talk about pros and cons you guys should think about before you make that leap. Bottom line, what I really want to do is share some thoughts with you so you can make the best decision possible to make sure that the worship experience in your church for your congregation and your budget is really, at the highest level of everything we're talking about today. So from my experience, that whole conversation about what to buy, etc., should be had from a healthy dialogue perspective. What we did, we have a multi-campus church, and when we were deciding between keeping an acoustic kit, moving the acoustic kit, shield, cage, etc., electronic drums, etc., what we did was we got together as a team, and the team included two drummers, myself included, and the head of the tech team, and we got the input from worship leaders, and we also had one of our techs on board as well too. And we kind of talked between us, and we kind of laid out the pros and cons. And that conversation went over a couple of weeks, and it was a really healthy dialogue about sort of us sharing our own, pros and cons, and have you thought about this, and what if we did this, etc. So, first and foremost, I would say communication is the absolute first thing you want to do. Specifically in our case, it is a multi-campus site, but the main campus that we were addressing, the drum needs, serves a couple of different purposes. One of the services there is a very traditional type of service, and mostly features an orchestra, a choir, singers, very traditional hymns, etc. And then literally the very next service is your regular contemporary, full-blown, here we go, rock band type of thing. So that one drum set has to do a lot of heavy lifting between those genres. And that was a big consideration. And even if you don't have something as varied as that, you should still be thinking about variation. You should still be thinking about the music that you play throughout the year. And, that kit has to serve all of those different timbres, those different volumes, those different textures, if you will. My point there is, when you think about your kit, you really have to think about the room that it's in and the size of the room and the type of music that's mostly played and the congregation and what you're used to playing. I would say try to eliminate from your mind the sort of what if, it could be sounding like this, because that's really not a great way, from my perspective, for you to jump into this. So food for thought before you even go down the road of saying we need to get an electronic kit. You have an acoustic kit, you have cymbals. And, of course, sound is subjective. But my point here is, if you have an acoustic kit today with cymbals, first of all, I would say to you, oftentimes, when you think about volume, it's not the volume of the drums. It may be the cymbals. Some cymbals are just meant to cut through loud music, and they're very harsh. I can't stand it when I go next to a drum set and the drummer has, that snare cranked up tight and it's, cracking. It's abrasive. It hurts. Not only the drums, but the cymbals too. They hit it and it's piercing. So, the first thing I would say is take a deep breath and look at your kit and really listen to it objectively. Does it sound good? I've heard drummers play on a kit and sound magnificent. I've heard drummers play on a high-end kit, great gear, etc., acoustically and, mic'd up. That sounds absolutely terrible. So a lot of it, of course, comes from how the drummer plays. That's without question. You get a great drum set and you put an inexperienced drummer on there that's just wailing away, it's going to sound harsh. Conversely, you can get a great drummer on a pretty lousy kit, and that great drummer is going to make that kit sound pretty darn good. So oftentimes it's really not the gear, it's kind of the players who are playing it. If you're in that situation and you're saying, yeah, but those are the drummers that I have, then you do have to make some changes to that kit. But again, I'm going to say, let's go through a pro-con list on eDrums, but I'm going to give you some alternatives at the end that I think should open your mind as far as saying, well, what if we did this? Because you might save yourself an awful lot of money and awful lot of heartbreak if you pull a trigger on the wrong thing. So to me, the first thing I do whenever I'm making a large gear purchase is I write out my own pro and con list, and I take time with that list. I don't just jump into it. And I usually write out all of the pros and all of the cons I can possibly think about, and that gives me a better angle as far as making the right purchase decision, especially when you're making a really big change. You don't want to just jump into that. So, in this situation, a good pro-con list probably should have Acoustic or eKit or some other alternative or hybrid or etc. Today's conversation, I'm going to center around pros and cons of an eKit for you to think about. Again, I have 30 years of experience on eKit. I've played so many different of them. I've owned an absolute ton of different electronic gear. Even though I now own the top-end Roland kit, is not what I'm suggesting you go buy. Now, that being said, you can't beat it. It's the best of the best of the best. But, you're talking about a kit that is, well north of $10,000 all in. And, right there, you probably held your heart and gasped for breath, as you should. So, let's go through all of the pros and cons. So, under the pro list, the very first thing you should think about is volume. I need to control our volume. And this is a pro of electronic drums. They are nowhere near the volume of a good acoustic set or a bad acoustic set. So volume is probably the number one driver. But I would hesitate for 1 second and say it's also a con, and I'll address it right now. When you hit these drums, you're dealing with here mesh and rubber, etc., and sticks, and you're still hear that sound? That is not pleasurable. That is a very annoying sound. It's an annoying sound for the worship band, and it's a real annoying sound in a smaller room, because the first couple of rows of your congregation can clearly hear that set. And even if you have a really good sound system, and I'll get to that in a second, you're still going to hear in that room that whack, 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 because you've taken the volume so far down on stage, and you can't hide that. So you've got to think about that from what I'm saying is immediately put a caution flag over the idea of saying this will control our volume, because it may not. And then space may be a consideration. A really good acoustic set can take up quite a bit of space, and you can get an electronic set, with pads as opposed to the full shell type, and really condense that down. And that's a fair point. So the next one up is another big one, sound quality. You're going to say, we can control the sound, it's going to be fabulous. And truthfully, it can be. And it can also be a train wreck. And I've seen both sides of it. Quite frankly, I'd probably say more often than not, I saw the train wreck side of it. Let me explain. A good electronic set, at its best, has either a good sound module, or you're using a laptop with a VST such as Easy Drummer 3 or Superior Drummer 3. I use both. And you have all of these sounds. But that's subjective to, do you have a tech savvy drummer that knows how to set up an electronic set correctly? Because if you don't, it won't play the right way. And do you have a tech savvy drummer that can go into the module and figure out which kits should be best used for worship? Most electronic kits can hold, 100 drum sets. And you don't want your drummers up there switching 100 drum sets. You probably want a couple and just kind of lock it down and just say, okay, drummers, use kit number 1, 2, and 3. Don't use anything else. And that's just the drummer. Now you have the front of house, the engineer. And let's face it, a lot of churches don't have professional sound people. A lot of times you have a volunteer. So I've been in situations with a very good electronic set that in my ears, I tuned it up and I got it to sound great. And, the front of house engineer for that service, let's put it this way, the front of house engineer didn't really know, how to get sound in a good way. And the sound in the room was, let's just be nice and call it less than desirable. Been there, done that. So these things exist. And, you have to be careful with or at least think about these things. I've also been in a church where I've set up the electronic set and I'm like, this sounds great. And then I leave for a couple days and I come back and somebody's gone in there and done something else and all my work is gone. But my point is even if you have a really seasoned pro or semi-pro, whatever, somebody knowledgeable that can get in there and set it up, doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. Somebody is always going to go in and figure, I can figure this out better, and that sound is, again, off the table. On the other side, I've been in a church with a good electronic set and some great engineers over time, and it just sounds amazing. So much so that I've had worship leaders and band members turn around and look at the kit and say, I've never heard that kit sound so good. So it can be great, it can be awful. And I want to make sure that you understand both sides of those and really think about your team and, again, the congregation and the church that you're in. And then the last pro is choices, especially today. There are so many different brands and so many different price points. So depending upon what your budget is, you can most likely find a pretty good kit within that budget because the choices are just so vast and, the quality just keeps getting better on electronic sets. All right, cons. So I already talked about the physical volume of the pads and kind of beat that one into the ground. No pun intended, but you get my point with that. And then as far as sound, think about your worship team all of a sudden. It's like if you have an acoustic set, the worship team is used to hearing the drums right there. All of a sudden, the drums aren't right there. The drums are hitting these, whack, crack, whack, whack, and the sound is coming out from the sound system. So depending upon what your sound system is like and what your amplification is like and what your monitoring system is like, it completely changes the worship team's experience as far as, playing the music. So massive consideration as far as, how are you going to amplify and monitor this so it sits appropriately in that room. So another con is the sound quality in the room. And again, sound quality is always subjective, and I talked about this earlier, but when you think about the sound quality, you can get some of the most amazing electronic sounds today using either a module or using a VST. It's highly, I was almost going to say easy. It's highly doable if you have somebody skilled enough to be able to set it up correctly and run pro sound at the other end. It will sound unbelievable. I would also caution on that. Once you do invest in the time, invest in the kit, invest in the time, invest in the people, and have it set up, then you need to make sure you lock it down. You need to make sure that everybody that comes in, sound engineer, drummers, whatever, know this is the kit that you use. Do not touch anything. And I know that sounds mean, but unless you lock it down, you're going to be in for a bad surprise come some Sunday morning when you turn on a thing and like, what happened? The drums sound horrible. Another consideration, a big one, a con, is, quite frankly, most drummers hate eDrums. They just do. If you look I'm on multiple drummer forums, And this conversation comes up every single day. Somebody says, hey, I want to switch to an eKit. What do you guys recommend? And there's always a handful of comments. Don't. Worst decision ever. Blah, blah, blah. And I get it. There's a saying that I absolutely love. A mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. And that's been my point of view. I would think, if I was a guitarist and I played an electric guitar with a Marshall stack or a really nice Fender twin reverb, and then I pick up an acoustic guitar, I'm still a guitarist, and it's still a guitar. Completely two different instruments. Same thing if I'm a really good keyboard player, which I'm not, and I want to play a grand piano, which is an absolutely gorgeous instrument, and then I go over to a Nord stage and I'm playing that, and I can do both really well, great, So that's my point of view with drums. eDrums now, the better ones, are so well made that a lot of drummers that would say, I don't like eDrums, probably haven't played on a really good set, dialed in where the pads are really to the point of I can play it on this kit 95% of exactly the same way I play on acoustic drums. I play on eDrums at home, I play on all acoustic gear these days at church, so I bounce between the two. And quite frankly, that's another big thing for you to think about is, if you have drummers that explicitly only play on acoustic gear, when they get in and start playing on an electronic set, it's like a whole different world. It's like having a concert pianist and you give them a Fender Rhodes and go, here, play. Sure, they can play the mechanics of it, but it's not the same. You still have to play the instrument. You can't just hit it. You really have to play expressively to make the drums come alive. So another con is, again, hold your chest on this one, the cost. A decent eKit, and I would say both new and or used, if you're looking at getting a decent set, so if you're looking at a new set, I would say your typical budget is between $2,500 to $4,000 in that range. You can easily get up to $5,000. When you step up and you're really going to go for it and get a good set, now you're talking easily $6,500, $8,000, $9,000. It can easily balloon up there very quickly. Now, those kits, those high-end kits, are high-end for a reason. The playability is just phenomenal. The sounds, although subjective to my ear, are phenomenal. It's just unbelievable what you can do with them, and the playability is just so amazing. The textures and the variances of all of the different textures you can get out of these kits, just amazing. If you have a mellow type of song, it's hard for an eDrum set that's not a good set to really kind of bring those textures. I'm not talking volume, I'm talking about the physical sound, the real sound of the kit and the playability of it. Can you get those really light press rolls on it? Can you do really even cymbal swells, cymbal chokes, things like that? That is a big deal in how you play how you play worship music. Think about it. Think about the music that you play. It's not all one volume, and nor is it like sort of three. It swells up, it gets really loud and majestic, and then it pulls way back down. You need a kit that can actually do that. Sure, there are plenty of kits you can get under $1,000. I see this question every day. My church's budget is $600 and we want a really good eKit. Oh, it's just not real. That's not a real question. It can't be done. Now there are workarounds. You don't have to get a module. You can get it. There's a system called the eDrum, and you can get software under $200. Easy Drummer 3 only costs, I think it's $189. You do need a good laptop, and you need a drummer that knows how to set this all up. So there are variables to bring the cost down. But all said, a regular drum kit that you buy, either used, by the way, if you do buy used, which I've bought a few, always look for mint or excellent condition. So be very cautious with that. But you can easily get it. Specifically, look at Reverb. Reverb is a great place for you to buy used gear. And you can tell, if the gear, just by looking at the pictures, has this gear been lovingly taken care of. All right, so that's my list of pros and cons. Hopefully I gave you some things to think about. Let me give you some alternatives. And again, this is sort of a been there, done that. So I talked at the beginning about, if you have an acoustic set now, maybe it's not the drums, maybe it's the cymbals. To me, most worship music is just far better when you're using washy, dark type cymbals. So if you've got, bright cutting cymbals that are specifically made for a rock pop, they might not be the best thing. Now, this is highly subjective, and I'm a cymbal nerd. But dark washy cymbals really sit well in the music. I did a separate video on choosing cymbals. You can go look at that. I'll give you some pointers there because that's a very deep subject. And again, very subjective. But my point here is that before you go out and spend so much money, you can get a set of cymbals for far less money that might solve all your issues. Next thing is the drums themselves. You can take a drum set. Let's say you have a really nice set of cymbals on that, but those drums just sound harsh. There are so many different ways, changing heads, to adding or changing the tone, the tuning of the drums, adding some muffling to the kit, miking it up nicely, miking up just the kick drum, etc. Using less mics. Maybe it's just a kick drum and one overhead, and if the drum set is set up correctly, that's going to be great. So, first and foremost, look at your kit and just say, hey, before we just move away from this, is there something we can do here? So, some other things that I've done is again, full electronic set, play full acoustic set, but I also do hybrid. And I've done that in my home studio before too. Think about buying low volume cymbals. Again, if it's the drums sound okay, but it's the cymbals, there are tons of low volume cymbal sets. Again, I cover this in my cymbal video, but you could use low volume cymbals, and if the room is really small, don't even bother miking them, and it's going to sound great. Or you could throw one overhead on, you'll hear the drums acoustically, the cymbals just dial in the board with low volume cymbals, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, it sounds really good. You can use the inverse of that. You could use electronic drums and real cymbals, because the playability of electronic cymbals is still one of the most big barrier points for most drummers that are switching over. Again, a high-end kit, you can get great playability, but mid-tier and below, those cymbals, especially the hi-hats, just not really that good and hard to dial in. So you can use electronic drums, take care of that part of it, and use acoustic cymbals. Now, it's kind of odd when you hear it because you've got cymbals happening right here and the drums coming out to speakers, but it's doable. And I'm saying, again, it's another variation. I've also done electronic drums with low volume cymbals, and that sounds great. There are some drum tech videos out there from a few years back, and they show you this is what an electronic drum set sounds with all of these different sets of low volume cymbals. One mic, and it sounds fabulous. And then, depending upon the size of the room, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of our campuses is an old community-style church, with the high ceilings, etc. And to me, I've played drums in that room, I've played electronic drums in that room, and in hindsight, after playing there so many times, I would say that room needs a cajon, period. Now, some drummers would say, oh my goodness, not a cajon. To me, I get called upon often throughout the year to somebody will say, hey Dennis, can you play cajon for this service? Now, when they say that, they know I'm going to bring my cajon kit. Let me explain that quickly. I have a cajon, I sit on it, but I have a direct drive cajon pedal, so I'm using my cajon both as a kick and a snare with one mic on it. I use a snare and I put a muffler on it, BFSD quesadilla. I use special rods with it. I get this really good fat backbeat type of sound. It's really warm, not a lot of volume. I'll use a set of nice hats and usually one cymbal, and that's it. I'll use a shaker or tambourine or something. And that kit, that small kit, sounds like a real drum set, because it is. And it has all of the different textures and everything you want without the volume. So again, something else for you to consider if you have a smaller room and a tight budget. And then you can look at drum shields. And there are pluses and minuses. You can get a shield, you can get a taller shield, you can get a full wraparound shield, you can get a full cage with the ceiling on it. And those will certainly take care of volume. But it also opens up another whole list of problems, and there are many videos out there on this. I'll just touch on it quickly. The drummer's in there, and it's like, great, now I'm enclosed. Wham! and the drummer starts, whacking the crap out of the drums, and you're like, oh my goodness. Now you have two problems. First of all, the drummer is playing way louder than they used to, only because they feel like, well, I'm enclosed, nobody can hear me. That's not true. And number two is that's plexiglass. There's all kinds of weird reflections in there. So from a drummer perspective, when I play in a cage, I use ear protection and over-ear headphones because it's bombastic inside of that cage. It literally is deafening. So that's number one. Number two is the drummer still has to play appropriately for the music. And number three is the sound engineers have to spend a lot of time re-engineering the microphones and the way it sounds because of all of these weird reflections in there. And even with all of that, I've been in many services when, I've had singers say the drums are too loud. And you think to yourself, how can they be too loud? They're literally enclosed. It's still a bombastic and acoustic instrument. So things to think about as far as just saying, well, a shield will solve it. And well, it sort of does and sort of doesn't. And then last bit of advice, I would say, if you're still not sure, spend some time and go to local churches as a participant. Go in there and sit down and listen to a service. Go to a couple different churches, ones that use electronic sets, acoustic sets, smaller rooms, mid-sized rooms, larger rooms, shields, drum cages, etc., etc. Listen to it objectively as a participant, as somebody in the congregation. Does it sound good to you? Now, you can't just use one or two churches and just say, oh, I was in a church and they had an eKit and it sounded horrible, because you could go into another church with an eKit and it sounds amazing. And if it does sound amazing, go speak to somebody afterwards. My point is that as part of your research, go out and do your own R&D. Let your ears tell you what you want. It's very easy for either a drummer or somebody in the band to say, we need this and we should go get that. So again, going back to what I said earlier, have a group conversation, talk about it, but do the deep dive, go out and explore different options, etc. I hope this information is good for you. I covered a lot of ground today. Any questions, as always, hit me up, and I appreciate you watching the video. Have a good one.